right. Steve's going to
thank you.
About,
Thank you very much, Ralph. And okay, thank you. The last time we did this for the Quest in Sicily, it was a blizzard that night. We did this thing, and there were like 3 people who came and stuff. So I'm a little bit in shock here that there were quite so many people. So I'm going to move fairly quickly through this for the sake of the hour here, because I'm sure everybody would love to get to the wine, you know, and get on. So what I'm going to focus on is really my own background. I have to admit I know next to nothing about the Troubadours or the Cathars, and I've never been to Languedoc, so I really don't. I'm looking forward to it with the rest of us. So, but what I'm going to focus on is a transition that occurred around just before 1200, or in the 12th century, in the early 12th century, from a kind of architecture that's known as the early medieval period, or Romanesque architecture, that has circular arches. And it's Romanesque because it was taken from the Romans, like the Romans. And that dominates the period from about 500 up to about 1000 or about 1100 AD. And then there's a very sudden shift in the architectural work into later medieval architecture, or what's known as Gothic architecture. And this is an architecture where the arches are all pointed. Right? And this happens rather suddenly, and as we'll see, let's see if I can actually figure out how to operate this thing here. I think if we move ahead. So these are three scales of operation. This is kind of the microcosm, and this is Jesus in the Vesica, or Christ in the Vesica, from the west portal of Chartres, from the entrance of Chartres. This is the constellation Virgo, and this is the background, the mesocosm, or this is the macrocosm and the microcosm, and France itself is the body on which this is taking place, the middle ground, or the civilization of France, so to speak. So let's see, how do I move ahead here? Am I supposed to hit a thing, or is it this? No, there it is, okay. Got to figure out which button to push nowadays. So I love time charts, as they reveal patterns. But there are 2 basic influences that cause this change in the culture. And we can see that it comes about simultaneously with certain other things as well. There's an influence from Spain, from Muslim Spain, that's very critical. Muslim Spain was far more advanced culturally and far wealthier and so on, far more civilized than anything going on in Europe at the time in this early period. And people from, there was an advanced educational system that I'm referring to here as the School of Toledo. There were a number of schools all around in France, in Spain rather, and people from Northern Europe, Christians from Northern Europe, from England and Ireland and Northern France and Germany, would go to Spain to be educated. And of course there was a large Jewish community there, so you had you had representatives of the 3 major religions studying at these universities together. And it's presumed that they kind of met outside of school as well and exchanged things that maybe weren't so orthodox. Maybe found out that these 3 paths are much more similar than they are different. And this ran until 1185 when Toledo fell to the Christians, to the Spanish kings, and then that was sort of cut off. But one of the people who studied there was this man Fulbertus, who becomes the Bishop of Chartres and begins what's called the School of Chartres, which is a Neoplatonic school. And it runs for about 2 centuries. Up here we have the Crusades, and the first Crusade here, right at the end of the 11th century, and they take Jerusalem, right, and I think it's in 1099, and they hold it for about 100 years. So Spain is cut off. The Crusade begins. There's clearly an outward expansion going on. Prior to this, Christian Europe had kind of been getting squeezed together, actually, from the south and from the east. But now they've reversed it over in a rather sudden period. It gets reversed. Spain begins to fall. This is known as the Reconquest. And then Jerusalem falls to them. So the thing has really turned around right in here. The whole thing turns around. And within a very few years after that, you get the formation of the Knights Templars. And they begin a kind of an influence from the East, basically. And it's still a Muslim influence. So there was a Muslim influence from Spain that gets cut off. But then almost simultaneously with that, there's an influence from the East through the Templars. So you have the school of Chartres being influenced by Spain, and then you have the Templars being a much more Eurocentric aspect. And you see it's almost simultaneous with the beginnings of the Troubadour era, and almost simultaneous with the persecution of the Cathars. Now the Cathars exist back in here, but the persecution begins. So there's something that's going on right here, and there's a couple of personalities that stand out. One of them is Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, who gives his blessing to the Knights Templars. He gives them their, he's the one who rationalizes the warrior-monk fusion, which had hitherto not existed really within Christianity. These things were kind of considered separate. And he fuses, he provides the ideological and theological basis to fuse that and to justify the Templar existence. And so he's an important figure. He also participates in the Cathar persecution later on in his career, which is also interesting. So he's there for both of those things. He's in favor of one and of course against the other. The other person is this man known as Abbot Suger, who is he's the head of the church at Saint-Denis, which is the royal church where the king goes to church on Sunday, so to speak. And he is the first person to begin this new architectural impulse. He's the first person to externalize it, and he begins work on Saint-Denis, I think it's about 1135. So it was there very few years, right in here, and you get the beginning of this new architecture. This building here at Saint Front is the old architecture. We'll see it in a few slides. And these buildings here are the initial buildings in the Gothic system, the pointed arch system. They're all developmental in a sense. They're all in a small area of what's known as Ile-de-France and Champagne, and they're all dedicated to the Virgin Mary, with the exception of Saint-Denis. But all of the new ones, Saint-Denis was pre-existing, but all the new churches are all, well, actually some of these were pre-existing too, but they were all dedicated to the Virgin Mary. So this is the time chart. So let's see. And then it ends, then the whole thing you see comes to an end around here. The whole era comes to an end. Here, Dante and Giotto obviously mark the beginning of the Renaissance, actually, and the buildings are finished, and you get the 100 Years' War, the plague breaks out, and so on. And the School of Chartres is finished here. They get closed by the church. The Neoplatonists always get into trouble, and they do eventually. And then you get Aquinas, who starts the School of Paris. The scene shifts to Paris under Aquinas, and the whole thing is just put in a nice clean box, you know. It's all cleaned up now, and interestingly, what's his name? Aquinas is the person who changes one of the 7 liberal arts. From dialectic, he changes it to logic, right? A lot less dangerous a subject. Right? Dialectic is dangerous because you're in a conversation and you might get someplace that's politically incorrect. But logic is the tool, so you can't go wrong. It's like, I'm giving you the hammer, but I'm not telling you what to hit, kind of, you know. That was the mistake they made. This was the mistake they made. Okay, so let's get out of this one, and let's go on. A couple of concepts. Most of this is not that important here, but there's a cosmogenic cycle, what I'm calling a cosmogenic cycle, that can generally be thought of as the proceeding, the maintaining, and the returning. And the way it manifests geometrically, these are Platonic terms here, but the way it manifests geometrically is in these systems, what I'm calling the root 2 system, or the 2-fold power, 2- and 4-fold power, the 3-fold power, and the 5-fold power. So 2, 3, and 5, or you could, if you want to say it a little differently, you could call it the 3, 4, and 5, right? Because 2 and 4 are in the same family. So this is the famous Pythagorean archetype. And in Lawler's book, Robert Lawler's book, Sacred Geometry, he characterizes the root 2 system as a proceeding mode system. He identifies it as a proceeding mode, he identifies the root 3 system as a maintaining mode, and the root 5 system as the returning mode. These are the 3 orders of classical architecture. We won't be using them tonight, but they symbolize these things. This is from Vitruvius. He associates these different orders and symbols, their sets of symbols, with these modes of being. Right? So, but we're going to be looking at these systems: the root 2 system, the root 3, and the root 5. Because what we'll find is that that the system changes from this root 2 system to a root 3 system when they make this change in the architecture. So the root 2 system, I'll just briefly, I won't go too deeply into it, but it's based on the idea that if you have a square whose side is equal to 1, the diagonal of that square is equal to this figure known as the square root of 2. Right? And you can take this diagonal and apply it onto an extension of the side of the square, and you get this rectangle that is referred to as a root 2 rectangle, because its sides are 1 and the square root of 2. Okay? Now, there's a number of ways that you can manipulate this in terms of design, in terms of creating geometrical patterns that you can then map over designs or map designs onto, as it were. So you can take the square, and you can take a square, let's say in here, and you can put another square outside of it at 45 degrees and put another square around that. Basically what you're doing is you're sort of unfolding the square. Let me see if I can I find it here? Yeah. If we take this triangle here and we unfold it, so to speak, we get another triangle, and if we do that 4 times, we can double the area of a square without having to calculate anything. This was why, see, in the ancient world, they didn't have the number system that we have. They had rather cumbersome numbering systems. So they couldn't deal with a figure like the square root of 2 the way we can do it. This is algebra. This was invented in I think in the 16th century, the 17th century, very late. The ancients didn't have it. So they couldn't say these things the way we could say them, so they would say them geometrically. See, because geometrically, it's very easy to do, but you can't calculate it, because this is not a whole number, so it doesn't actually exist as a number. Anyway, so you can fold these things out, and you can double the area of the square. That was one problem. You can also, if you take a compass and you put the pin in here, and you open to half of the diagonal, to the center of the square, and you strike off 4 arcs, you will set up a progression here, or a division, a pattern of division that has a predominant center and 2 lesser parts, and you'll set up the octagon as well. And you can also, as a form of manipulation, you can take the original square and just turn it 45 degrees. So, and there's all kinds of things. This is only the beginning of the manipulation of this. This was very common. It was a common system in ancient Rome. And this is a late building, but we could have done earlier ones as well. It's just an obvious one. This is known as the Basilica of Constantine. The remains of it are still there. This is the exterior of it here, and the interior of it. In this drawing, we're sort of standing here, and we're looking this way, and this arch would be this, and these big arches here would be here, in here. And you can see that there, if we take the width of the building as a square, and we strike those arcs that were showed in the last slide, you'll get the lines of structure of this building. And if you take the square and you turn it, you'll get the width of the building. You get the length. So you've got the width, and now you get the length, and you get the interior structure of the building. So this is what's known as a root 2 system, right? And the Romans, this was really, the Romans loved this, and it was a public system. The famous architect Vitruvius actually discusses this publicly in his book, whereas he never mentions the golden section. He talks around it like Plato does, but he never actually uses the name. So you begin to think after a while these guys are in some kind of club where you're not allowed to mention the name of this thing. Okay, it's a long story about that. Here's a later building, actually a building built in Syria where they're now fighting. This is in the area where they're now fighting. And it was a praetorium, which was a courthouse, basically, in Roman times. It gets converted to a church around the year 400. And you can see, again, I won't belabor this thing, it's just a smaller version of the Basilica of Constantine. Very simple procedure. It's a square. You strike off some arcs, and you're done. That's it, you know. This is Roman times, man. No subtlety at all. This is an example of, this is this building called San Front in Perigeo. It's off to the east, to the northeast of our area, but it's a prime example of this idea of Romanesque architecture. It's a series of squares that are divided, as we'll see. The spans and the structure are modulated by this root 2 system, and I won't belabor it particularly here. Here's a kind of a reconstruction that I did. If we take a square ABCD up here, we divide it into 9 smaller squares, then we get the essential pattern of the building, and then in the center, to get the relation of the structure to the span, we set up an octagon using the methods of the previous slides. We can take this little square in here, we set up a pattern with octagons and squares. It's one of the semi-regular grids. And within that square, we can take another square and position the structure, and here's the 5 squares of the building. And one of the things I'm fond of doing, it's a little confusing in this drawing, but when you analyze a classical building in this geometrical fashion, you can draw the plan and the elevation and the section, what's called the section or the cut, on top of one another, on the same geometrical pattern, because they're all constructed, the whole building is constructed on the same pattern. So all of the three-dimensionality of the building conforms to a pattern. It's a little confusing in this one, but you can see the same square that's informing the plan is also informing the section and the elevation of the building. All right, so that's Romanesque architecture. And here's this turning point where the Crusaders take Jerusalem. We won't belabor it. The origin of the Knights. The Knights, within a few years after the taking of Jerusalem, these 9 so-called poor knights, who just happen to all be members of the ruling families of Champagne and Ile-de-France, and related to the whole nobility, show up in Jerusalem, and they get permission from the king, who's also a relative of theirs, Baldwin, I think is the guy's name, who's also a relative, to escort pilgrims. Now, in fact, they don't ever, I don't know that there's no record of them ever having escorted a pilgrim, actually. But it's an excuse to carry weapons. I mean, it's basically an excuse to be armed. And they are housed in this building, actually, that's known as the Al-Aqsa Mosque today. They actually stayed in Al-Aqsa. And it's this is serious business. If you there was a, what's his name, Sharon visited Al-Aqsa one time in a political campaign. It was rioting for weeks. Jerusalem went nuts for weeks because he visited Al-Aqsa. It's incredible. So they're still very sensitive about this. But these guys lived there for 9 years. Right? They lived at Al-Aqsa for 9 years. It's right next to the Dome of the Rock. It's not the Dome of the Rock itself. It's right next to it. And what they found is not actually known. They excavated under the temple for 9 years. That's a long time to dig under the temple. Again, if you move a stone, if there even is a rumor that somebody's going to go down there today, there's rioting. I mean, it's incredible. So this is a serious place, serious stuff. Nobody knows what they found. Did they find the Ark? Did they find the bodies of people? Did they find, who knows? We don't know. But 9 years later, they returned to Europe, and they moved right to the head of the class. And we've heard a little bit about this, so I won't belabor it. St. Bernard writes the rule and proclaims this as he validates the warrior monk theory. 10 years later, they granted extraordinary privileges by a protege of Bernard, Innocent II, and they now become a state within a state. They become an international banking house, as we've heard. They get the right to build their own buildings, and they have a fleet of ships, the whole thing. It's an incredible scene. And they reach the apogee in here 1177 when they defeat Saladin. But the end is not long in coming. Here, great minds think alike. We've copied the same slide off the internet. But this is the building. This is actually supposedly a building in London, which I've never seen, and I hadn't heard about it. And clearly this drawing is taking place in that building. I mean, whoever did the drawing knew about this place. But the key to these guys is that they're an initiatic organization. This is the key for me. And whenever you're dealing with initiations, you're dealing with some kind of a mystery. There's always a mystery there. And you're always being brought through the cycle of creation, that cycle that I showed at the beginning. You could call it birth, life, and death. Right? And in the initiation, normally in life we start in birth and then we live and then we die. But in the initiation, you start in life and then they pretend to kill you and take you through the underworld and then you're reborn. So you experience the cycle off kilter in a way that makes you hyper aware, I think, that there's this cycle is involved, right? So whenever you hear initiation, right, that's the key. And this, of course, is what they're hoisted on at the end, right? It's because they have a private initiation. So that opens the door in the end for their fall, because you can charge them with anything. You can say anything you want at that point. And most of it was boilerplate, apparently, that they were charged with, right, spitting on the cross and so on. Anyway, so here's Bernard, this interesting portrait, and of course they were shown with the building, which is cool. And he's the backbone of this thing called the Cistercian order. It was a reform in its own day. I won't go into the Cistercians, but this is not Clairvaux. His base was Clairvaux, which was given to him by one of the 9 knights. I think Hugh of Champagne gives him Clairvaux. I mean, and he was a relative. They were all relatives. But Clairvaux has been renovated beyond recognition, so to show what the architecture would have been at the time of the founding of the Knights, it would have been something like this building at Fontenay. One way to look at these buildings is to get a sense of the solid to void ratio. So here the openings comprise only a very small percentage of the wall. Right? And this is characteristic of Romanesque architecture, and you'll notice that there's a big division. There are these big vertical piers here that divide the facade into 3 parts. So and they have very low, they have very high mass to void ratio, and it's all done with circular arches. This is the courtyard that's behind this on the other side, and it's all done with circular arches and circles within circles and so on. All right. So this is the architecture that the Knights would have been familiar with. Then they get to Al-Aqsa, which is this thing. And the first thing you notice is that all of the major arches are pointed. Right? And here they're pointed. Now these are round up here, but all of the major arches are pointed. And so this would have, I think, impressed them actually very much. The Arabs had been doing these pointed arches for quite a while, for over 100 years. By the time the Knights got there. And basically what the pointing does is it directs the thrust more vertically downward. A dome or an arch wants to push its way out. Right? There's a load coming down and it carried down the arch, but the arch generates what's called thrust, horizontal thrust. So it wants to force itself out and wants to push the walls this way. So you have to resist that. And the only way to resist it in classical times was through mass. You just put a huge mass down next to this force and have it push back, basically. And it's just done with brute mass. And so by verticalizing the force, you reduce the mass necessary to counter the thrust. Therefore, you can have a greater opening. The space can open to a greater extent. Now, there's a lot of confusion about what, well, we'll get to Gothic architecture in a minute. I won't do it. I will just look at this for a second. This was one of our, one of my root 2 manipulations there, and here's the arcs. Well, they're starting from here now, right? And it becomes the Templar cross. And this was just fascinating to me. I threw this in because these are the ships of Christopher Columbus, right? And he's got the Templar cross. Now this is 200 years after the Templars have ceased to exist. So these symbols persist. They're very powerful symbols. Now they probably were repositioned. I don't know if the Hospitallers took it over or one of the other orders took it over. But it's amazing that somehow there was something going on between him and this is the fall of the Templars. Saladin comes back, and this time he wins, and they take Jerusalem. Jerusalem is lost. There's a third crusade where the Templars team up with King Richard, and they take back some territory, but not enough. They hold on for about 100 years, but eventually they get pushed out. And as soon as they get pushed out, they're forced to leave Cyprus in 1303. Within 4 years, the king here has busted them, and he's got his own pope. You know, they had a pope, and so now he has a pope. You know, everybody can have a pope, their own pope if they want. This is a famous Avignon papacy, and that's the end of them, and they're gone. And of course, some people say they go to Scotland. Other people say they go to Switzerland. Where they become, you know, the Swiss all of a sudden become a military power after the Templars disappear, which is kind of odd. You know, they still have the Swiss guards down at the Vatican, right? And some people say it was the Knights, you know, changed the name. Some people say they even went to Canada, right? I think there's even a couple of stories that they went to the Midwest. They got as far as, yeah, they got as far as, like, you know, Illinois and places like that. I mean, I don't believe that, but because they find stone things, you know, and they're unwilling to admit that Native Americans could have actually moved pieces of stone. So, well, who could have done it? You know, well, it must have been the Templars. So they scratched their heads. Okay. And then some wag put this on the internet. Now, this is not the old Templar cross. This is the modern Templars. These are what is it, Albert Pike or whatever? No, it's not Albert Pike. Yeah, from Pike's Peak, right? Who invented these guys in the modern age. And they gave it this symbol, this double cross symbol, and they also used this. This is the modern Templars. This was not the ancient symbol. They used this angled over cross. And here's this thing, you know. But these symbols these are very powerful symbols, and in fact, these guys actually have a fair amount in common with the Templars, if you think about it. Right? They're a state within a state. They're accountable to no one, right? Right? They're worth zillions of dollars. They got zillions of dollars. They got fleets of ships, right? They buy and sell real estate by the 1,000-acre or whatever. Very similar to the Templars, right? And they appropriate that, and it just so happens they appropriate that symbol. Well, anyway, okay. So Suger is the man who starts off Gothic architecture. And we won't go into this, but all of a sudden in this story, you get Dionysus the Areopagite. Now, this is known as the pseudo-Dionysus, right? Dionysus, Areopagite means you're a judge. In ancient Athens, there was a hill where they held trials. It was called the Areopagus. And so the judges became known as Areopagites. And this man Dionysus, the actual Dionysus, the Areopagite, Judge Dionysus, was one of the first Christians in Athens. And I think it was like the end of the 1st century or 2nd century. And he became a very well-known figure. Several hundred years later, about 300 years later, a monk in Syria somewhere assumes his name and writes a series of books that take Neoplatonist structures, if you will, and translate them into Christian terms. Right? So he's a Christian Neoplatonist. So it means that Suger was in some way a Christian Neoplatonist. Now, I don't know exactly what that means. He's not famous for being a mystic, and neither is St. Bernard, but yet they both dealt with some kind of personal work that went beyond the rituals that Greg was talking about. Right? It was, you know, beyond those dry rituals where you actually have to work on yourself. And he has this, and it's all about light. It's all a metaphor of light and about moving towards light. And you should lighten the heart, right? The work is noble work. It lightens the heart. It moves you toward the light. And the dull, this is great. The dull spirit rises up, right? Through the material to the truth. It's beautiful. And though you might be depressed, you become relieved when you are drawn to that light. And so the whole building becomes a metaphor of how you do that. Or it wants to become a metaphor of how you do that. Before we actually get to full-blown Gothic, there's a story that I usually tell. I won't belabor it here tonight, but it's a story of descent. It's abstracted from the Timaeus, and it involves 4 stages: unity, mystical unity, divine unity, a division within unity. This is, you know, the earth is without form and void, and God says, let there be light, and there's a division between light and dark. And then there's the firmament that's created, the structure is created and stabilized, and then manifestation can arise. And that's basically a very simple story, you know, much simplified. from Plato. And here it is again, stated again. Now, I'm drawing it here in two-dimensional forms, but in Plato, of course, he uses the three-dimensional figures called the Platonic solids. But you can make a transition. There's a million ways to tell this story, an indefinite number of ways to tell these stories. So here I'm taking this third stage, and I'm saying, well, okay, how do you go from the third stage to the fourth stage? And the answer is you reverse the triangle, and where these things cross, you get the crossing, right? They mark the right angle crossing. So this is, of course, the seal of Solomon, and this is the Christian symbol, right? But I'm taking this now from a man, I think his name is L. Gordon Plummer. I don't know if I'm getting that right. But he was a theosophist who grew up in a theosophical family on the West Coast somewhere, and he wrote this interesting book called Mathematics of the Cosmic Mind, or Nous. Cosmic mind means nous, right? In which he goes through this little creation story about how this figure here becomes what do they call it? The star tetrahedron. One of these is a tetrahedron. This figure here, for example, or this figure here, right? These are called the tetrahedrons. They're four equilateral triangles. And this figure becomes a kind of an elevation drawing of those two interlaced equilateral triangles. And one of the other properties of them is that their corners, their vertices, form the corners of a cube, right? The properties of these solids are very remarkable. Any one of them can give birth to all of the other four. And in fact, then there's a series of 12 intermediate ones called the semi-regular solids of Archimedes. That's the whole other, this is a process of transformation of the solids into one another. So let me try to keep moving here. This is actually a creation story. Within this, there's an octahedron that is kind of the heart of the whole thing, and Plummer likens the tetrahedron to the non-physical sheaths. What do they call them? I don't know, in Eastern study they call them something, but they're subtle. It's the subtle body, right, basically, the layers of the subtle body, and he's symbolizing that in this star tetrahedron. Very imaginative, really. And then if you, of course, if you unfold the cube, you get the Latin cross. So this is a creation story, kind of. It's a rather elaborate and fascinating creation story. I'm sorry? Oops, somebody? No? Okay. This is a metaphor for him. This is a metaphor. This is a kind of what he calls an esoteric crucifixion, an esoteric interpretation of crucifixion, right? That man, as embodied consciousness, can externalize, can rise to a higher level, externalize a higher being from within themselves. This is an esoteric story. And he goes on to point out that the cube has four faces. Each angle is 90 degrees. And if you multiply all of the degrees in the cube, it comes to 2160 degrees, which just happens to be the number of years in the Platonic month of the precession of the equinoxes, which gives rise to the avatar for that age. Right? So Christ is the avatar of the Piscean age. Right? And we're finishing up Pisces, and of course Plummer and the Theosophists are suggesting that when when the sun moves into a new constellation, that there'll be a new avatar who will arise. Right? So not exactly Orthodox Christianity here, but an interesting story nonetheless. The root 3 system on which Gothic architecture is going to be based is an extension of the root 2 system. The diagonal of this root 2 rectangle, if you apply it, it's equal to the square root of 3. This is kind of remarkable magic of these things. There's also this figure known as the vesica Pisces, in which two circles are related such that the center of one falls on the circumference of the other, and you get this football shape called the vesica Pisces. The length to the width is the ratio of the square root of 3 to 1. So it becomes a root 3 system. It gives rise to the equilateral triangle. This is the root 3 rectangle. This is the hexagon. And this is the first stage in what they call the flower. If I drew 6 more circles around there, you'd have the flower of life. So now we're ready to approach Chartres Cathedral. And one of the first things you can see, if you think about the church at Fontenay, the center was rather pinched. I don't know if I want to try to, I don't know, okay, I can't figure out how to go back, so I won't go back. But But you see here at Chartres, the entrances are now grouped in the center. The center has been expanded, and the entrances are grouped. The arches are pointed, although here they're not for some reason. I'm not sure why. But the arches are almost all pointed, and the rose window has now been expanded, right? And the facade generally hangs together in a little tighter way. These upper parts were later. And I just love this. I always love these shots of the church, because there's just no mistaking that, and there's no mistaking this image of the hands holding it up, you know, above the level of the city, above the level of the world. And this is the city down here. I mean, it comes up to about here on the cathedral. It's really fantastic. This thing is visible from all over. It's on a height, and it's visible from the whole region. Here's what happens in the building. The story of it geometrically. We start in unity, and we proceed through this, what I'm calling the sixfold patterns, the flower of life. If we put our compass pin here and we open our radius the whole way, we can strike off of vesica Pisces, and that vesica will give us the length and width of the building. It's these points here. And within that, the central circle from which we began embodies this cube, which we just saw in the plumber story, right? So all that esoteric stuff is here. Now this thing, if you think of it as what they call in India the yoni, or the birth organ, right? Then this is the womb. Now this is the birth organ of the Great Mother, and this is the womb, and this is the divine child, the Savior, right? Is being given birth to through the world. And then through a process of further subdivision, we actually get to the column base spacing and the crossing and these other, we can go on with this. And again, I'm drawing elevation and plan on top of one another, kind of because I can. I mean, it's just, I just get a kick out of that, because you can't do that with a modern building. There's no way to do it. Having drawn many modern buildings, I know that you can't do it that way. Details, we can go on, but this is a wonderful analysis by Critchlow of this rose window, using the square and the equilateral triangle, the power of 3 and the power of 4, working together, right? Gives you the pattern, and I actually demonstrated this at the Open Center one night here. Where again, the flower, and then a subdivision of the flower, putting a circle in here basically gives you the next circle in, and then you can do it again and again and again, and you find points on that, and you can construct all of the roses from this. So I won't go. This is a man named V.R. de Honeycourt. I just show this to show that these were actual techniques that were being used in the day. Here's the powers of 4, right? Powers of 3, powers of 5 that he's working on to get these elements. Right? Here's actual architectural elements. This is a profile of a series of a vertical pier that you see on Gothic work and so on. And he's got the rose window and everything. These are the early Gothic churches. There's a series of 8, 9, 10 of them, something like that. And they all interestingly respond to the distance of 365 feet from the door to either the turning point or to the back of the building. There's some major way they respond to 365 feet. Here's an old stone circle that also happens to respond to 365 feet and happens to use the vesica Pisces. So these things were there. The seeds were there, right, of all this stuff. Here's the scale of the project, to me, of these buildings, right? These are the cities in France, right? This is the constellation Virgo. Chartres is here. It's the sheaf of wheat. This is Paris. And these are the buildings. These are the major buildings in that first group of buildings, all dedicated to the Virgin Mary. So that's just the scale of the concept. I mean, they're literally as above, so below. I mean, they're taking it very seriously, right? But this is not unique. This is not unique. I mean, there were things done by Native Americans that have this kind of quality. There were things done in other parts of Europe and the Middle East. So this idea that you build, a civilization is basically a mesocosm, and it unites the forces of nature from above with the human needs that come from below. It's a distribution mechanism, right? And it has to be modeled on something that everybody understands and can participate in, and the sky is often what is used. So it's not an accident that we find this, and it's not so crazy. These are arches. I won't go into it, but there's a zillion ways to do arches, and depending on how many centers you want, there's one center with a circle, 2 centers, and a variety of two-centered ones, depending on where you want to put the centers. The further out you go, the higher the arch gets, and the more vertical the thrust gets. And then there's modifications of it here at Chartres. This is a man, Charpentier, a commentator, who says that they're using a pentagonal geometry. I've tried to do my own riff on it because I don't know that you would actually do this in the field. So I try to do this by basically using the golden section. As soon as you see the pentagon, you start using golden section. And this brings us to the fivefold power. So in the Romanesque, we had the fourfold, 2 and 4. And when in the Gothic system, we have the threefold. But behind it all is the fivefold architecture of the golden section. I won't belabor this right now. The pentagon embodies this golden section division. The golden section is a mathematical metaphor that returns you to unity through multiplicity. I won't be able to belabor that tonight, but that's why it won't go away. It's a metaphor of the spiritual journey itself, really. And finally, Rennes-le-Château. I'm not a big fan of these Rennes-le-Château mysteries because they're modern mysteries and they're of dubious quality. This is the famous painting by Poussin that they say is pointing to the grave of either Jesus or Mary Magdalene or somebody of great significance, and they claim that this little thing here is the landscape around Rennes-le-Château and so on. This fellow Lincoln, I think Henry Lincoln, has a conversation with this man Cornford, who was taught at the RCA and was a Neoplatonist commentator, and he says there's pentagonal geometry in here. I don't know that I'm, oops, well, I can't go, I don't think I can go back. Previous? No, it's not going to go back. Anyway, Rennes-le-Château, they claim there's pentagonal geometries, and they name certain points and cities, but to be perfectly candid, I can't make them work. I tried for about a week, and I'm going to have to get a hold of the French maps, I think, because that's the ones that Henry Lincoln was using. So, so it is still quite a bit of mystery about this. The good news is that there's no shortage of geometries. There's just a brief ransacking of the internet gave me more of these than I can figure out. These two I can't really figure out. This one I'm kind of intrigued with because he's got the vesica, see, and he's got the circle and the vesica. I want to explore that one, but I'll be exploring this a little more hopefully by June. And of course the mystery continues. And we hope you will join us in Carcasonne. This is from Buckminster Fuller, who Critchlow worked with for a while. And I've always been a fan of the Dymaxion map. And of course, one of the lines on this icosahedron runs right through Languedoc. And we're in the Chateau. You can see it. It's right here. This is Spain, right, and northern France and England. And that line runs right through where we're going to be going. So hope you'll join us. And thank you very much.